There's a paper published in the Journal of Applied Physiology about 3 or 4 months ago. I took the article and I said, it's really interesting. Let's see if there are any flaws in it. Because he concluded that you couldn't run a sub 2-hour marathon unless you're eating carbohydrates at 90 to 120 grams per hour. That's the finding. You cannot run a sub 2-hour marathon unless you take in 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrate every hour for 2 hours. So I went through very carefully his model. He made 2 assumptions that destroy the model. When you take in carbohydrates 120 grams per hour, he assumed that 120 grams was being burnt every hour. And that doesn't happen because when you take carbs, it takes about 60 minutes to 90 minutes before you reach these high rates of oxidation. And so you've got this lag phase. And during that lag phase, the athletes couldn't burn the amount of carbohydrate he said they needed to run that race. So therefore, his model proves that you can't run a sub 2-hour marathon on carbohydrates alone. So in trying to prove that carbohydrates are absolutely essential for a sub 2-hour marathon, he disproved it, which is fantastic. He proved you can't do it on carbs.
Welcome to the Plant-Free MD podcast with Dr. Anthony Chaffee, where we discuss diet and nutrition and how this affects health and chronic disease, and show you how you can use this to optimize your health and happiness, both mentally and physically. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me for another episode of the Plant-Free MD. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Chaffee. Today, I have a very special guest, someone who I've been looking forward to speaking to for a very long time, Professor Tim Noakes, who is an absolute monument in the field of sports medicine. Professor Noakes, thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm very honored to be with you and with your audience today. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. I know that most of my listeners know who you are, as I've referenced you quite a lot. But for those who haven't come across your work, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I got into medicine without really knowing what I wanted to do. And I soon realized that I was much more interested in science and understanding why things happen and trying to correct them rather than follow the medical pathway. And it turned out I just wasn't going to be very good at spending my life looking after patients. That's just not me. Maybe I'm too selfish. I don't know. But I then realized that I was interested in science. And so as soon as I'd graduated in medicine and done my internship in the hospital, that really taught me that I wasn't designed to do clinical medicine. And so I went straight into research. And at the time, there were really only 1 or 2 options I had to do research. And so I went into heart disease because the prof there was a good friend. We'd become quite friendly on a number of topics, and I really respected him. So I started in cardiovascular physiology, did my PhD in that. And then at the end of that, I was appointed as the first sort of junior lecturer in sports science. And they asked me to start sports science at the University of Cape Town, which I did. And then that led to sports medicine, developing sports medicine in South Africa. And I did that for the next 40 odd years until 2014, when things changed a bit for me. In 2010, I changed my diet. Before that, I'd been prescribing the high carbohydrate diet. I wrote the book Law of Running, which promotes a very high carbohydrate diet. And this became a very popular book. And classically, I've been seen tearing the pages out saying, I don't believe us. And anyway, so now I'm rewriting the 5th edition. But that promoted the high carbohydrate diet. And all that happened to me on a high carbohydrate diet was I developed type 2 diabetes. And then I was fortunate to read books on the low carbohydrate diet. I adopted the diet, reversed my type 2 diabetes, and just felt magic and I felt like 20 years younger. So it was an amazing experience. The consequence of changing my diet was I lost all my funding because the people who were funding me were interested in promoting the plant-based high carbohydrate diet. And they did that obviously for financial reasons. And so I lost all that funding. And then the university turned on me and it basically excommunicated me by saying that by promoting this diet, the low carbohydrate, high fat diet, I was killing people, killing babies and so on.
Oh, wow.
And so they turned their back on me, despite the fact that I'd worked there for 40 years and developed this center of excellence. And I'm just going to boast now that I'm the second most cited medical scientist at that university. Despite that, they threw me out and tried to humiliate me publicly. And I realized that I had a choice. I could either be humiliated publicly or stand up. Then it turned out, very fortunately, that I tweeted something and I was reported to the Health Professions Council in South Africa for saying that mothers should wean their babies onto a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, as we've done for millions of years.
Yeah.
But of course, people don't know the history. So that anyway, we then went to court for 4 years. I was in court for 28 days, had a brilliant support team. And in the end, we won that and we won the appeal. And so I had been charged for misconduct, etc. That I was cleared of everything. They found nothing wrong. There were 13 charges, and I won all 13 points. So that left me in limbo. And fortunately, and we'll talk about this, I think, that a young South African who's now working in America, he'd become interested in the low carbohydrate diet. He said, "Why don't we start doing some studies? Wouldn't you like to help us?" And so I did. And we've now, over the past 6 years, we've done some magnificent work that's never been done. And we reversed 100 years of teaching in the sports sciences. The evidence is about to break. It's not quite there, but I mean, it's about to be published, but it's there. Then I can tell you a bit about it. Mm-hmm. But it's been very exciting. So I got a second career. So here I am 10 years after retiring. I'm still as busy as ever. And writing papers, writing this massive review, the first major review I've ever seen of all the evidence of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise. And I've looked at about 500 studies. And when you look at those 500 studies, you finally get to understand what it's all about. Mm. And I think that, and then our research, while we were doing this, while I was preparing that, we were doing the research that we came to the definitive study to see if carbohydrates are important during exercise. And they are, but they're not the way we're taught. So I'm sure we'll get to that. So there's me, medical doctor, expelled from the medical profession, back into science, and still pushing the boundaries, I hope, in nutrition and sports science.
Yeah. Well, I think that not to be too, glowing and embarrass you or anything, but I think it takes a lot of integrity to go against your entire body of work and go against the system. You could have just retired and been top of the game, your book's selling fine, everyone just absolutely thinks you're the best. And you just walked off the champ and you said, no, that was wrong. I need to correct the record. And you caught a lot of heat for that. And I think it just takes a lot of integrity. And I just so want to congratulate you for that. And thank you for that, because without your struggles, we would be 10 years behind and we would be really struggling at this point. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, Anthony. For me, it was really simple because, I got diabetes on my own advice. So here I'm giving this advice and it caused me to get diabetes. So how could I live with myself to let that continue, knowing that this book is ranked as a great book on running? So everyone who picks it up is going to say, well, it's got to be high carbs. And the probability that they'll get diabetes in the long term is very high. So I couldn't live with that.
Yeah.
In any case, it changed my life so much. I just wish I was originally high fat, low carbs because I was born to British parents in Rhodesia in Zimbabwe, and there were no processed foods when I was born. So we ate real foods. And my mother used to feed me offal. My sister and myself, we got fed offal. Mm-hmm. So I was so fortunate. How many people, at least now, no one gets fed offal as a child, but I was fed offal. And my mother used to say that meat and fish are what give you brains. That's what she said.
Yeah.
So
she was right.
So I was very fortunate. And then I go to do my science, and I come under the influence of the cardiologists, and they say, no, you can't eat that. You've got to eat margarine and low fat. And I never ran as well again. And it was so sad because I had some great runs in my life, and I had running. I loved running, but it could have been much better if I'd been high fat all the time and not beginning progressively more diabetic. during those years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is a shame. And so now that you've come back and you've come back into the light, you've set about really trying to disprove this. So what are some of the experiments and trials that you've put forward to really sort of dispel this myth, or at least test the hypothesis that you don't need carbohydrates as an athlete?
So when Philip Prince approached me he's from Grove City College in Pennsylvania, which I see is quite it's a small college, but it's highly rated in America. And he just happens to have an amazing laboratory, and he can do clinical trials on runners and cyclists with great results. They're just very good at doing that work. And all he needed was a direction. So what research should we do? So he asked me, I said, well, why don't we test the high carb diet, high fat diet by putting people on a high carb diet for 6 weeks or so, and then having them do a performance trial, and then reversing that and putting them on a high fat diet for 6 weeks. And of course, we didn't do all of them at the same time. We broke them in half, etc., because that's the only way you can do it. So we do these randomized controlled trials, and we started at 5 kilometers. So I said, well, can you do reproducible 5K time trials on the treadmill in your laboratory? He said, yes, we get very good results. So I said, okay, well, let's do 5K time trials on these guys. And so we did. And we also did VO2 max tests before on the different diets. And guess what? VO2 max was exactly the same. And the 5K time trial was exactly the same, the performance. So the performance didn't change. So then I said, yeah, but what they're going to say is that it's because the guys still had some glycogen. Even though you're on a high fat diet, you still got enough glycogen to run 5Ks. I said, let's put the intensity of the exercise up and then do an activity which will produce muscle glycogen depletion. So we said, right, let's make it a 1 mile time trial. So we put the speed up to the 1 mile, and then they did the same experiments. And there was no difference again. The performance was identical. So those people eating a high-fat diet can run 1 mile just as fast whether they're eating carbs or fat. And then I said, okay, fine, let's do 6 times 800 meter intervals, because everyone knows that that's going to deplete your glycogen. So even if they start with some glycogen, by the third or fourth, they're going to have no glycogen left, and they're just going to fall over and not be able to exercise. So, of course, that didn't happen. The performance was identical for the 6 times 800 meter repetitions. And then by chance, because I didn't tell Philip to do this or suggested it, he measured oxygen consumption while they were doing the intervals. And we measured the fat oxidation rates. Now, the textbook says the following, and this is the Bible that I taught for 40 years, that there's a so-called crossover point, that as you increase your exercise intensity, you reach a point where you can only burn carbs. You can't burn fat. And that's usually at 85% VO2 max. And that idea was developed by a great friend of mine, George Brooks, who taught me so much. He helped us. When we did the studies of carbohydrate metabolism, we used tracers, and he was the expert on tracer methodology in the world. And he came to Cape Town and he showed us how to do it, and we've been friends ever since. So it's not as if I wanted to go out and disprove him at all. That was never the goal. We just happened to find this. So what we discovered was that when they ran the 6 times 800 meter intervals, they were running at 86% VO2 max. By chance, God came along and said, it's 86% VO2 max. So they were 1% over, and so they should have been burning 0 fat. They burnt the highest rates of fat oxidation ever recorded in humans in history. Nice. 1.5 grams per minute, it is enormous. I mean, that provides 3/4 of the energy to run a sub 2-hour marathon just by burning fat. So why do you need carbs? So anyway, that was what we found. And so that really was very exciting. But while we were doing that, we were doing another experiment, and I'm not going to give you the full results because it's not been published. Mm-hmm. But then I'll tell you what we did. You see, so we now had a model where we could change muscle glycogen before the start of exercise. And we had found that it made no difference running at those distances. So I said, okay, well, let's now do a long, prolonged exercise so that the guys get out and cycle at 70% of the VO2 max or whatever, and they go for as long as they can. And we're going to have them start with more muscle glycogen or less muscle glycogen because they followed the diets. And then we're going to give them just enough glucose, just enough to make sure that the blood glucose doesn't fall. Not enough to modify the metabolism, just enough to keep their glucose normal. And I had worked this out because it became apparent to me that in all these studies of carbohydrate metabolism and muscle glycogen depletion, no one was worried about the blood glucose level. They just ignored it. And I noticed that a lot of the studies, the blood glucose levels were low, including in the famous Bergstrom study, which is the one on which the whole thing is based. They took people, they put them on the high carbohydrate diet, had them exercise for as long as they could, and they found that the more carbohydrate in the muscle, the longer you could last for. And they said, you see, therefore, it's all muscle glycogen. But what they ignored was that everyone blood glucose levels dropped. They just ignored it.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is up to 1939, the teaching in sports science was that hypoglycemia, a falling blood glucose, is what causes fatigue. Mm. And that was the model. And it was said it's a brain effect. How do I know this? Because it was written in German, two famous writers, Christensen and Hansen, but they published it in German and no one bothered to read the articles. So I had the articles translated by a friend of mine who's a German. And he translated the sections, and there it said, what happens is when you take glucose, if you're tired, you take glucose and your performance goes up, it's just correcting your blood glucose level. It's got nothing to do with metabolism in the muscles, nothing at all. And they presented all the evidence for that. So that was the model. The model was falling blood glucose, your brain cuts in and says, I can't continue to exercise or your blood glucose is going to go low and the brain's going to be damaged. So you must stop exercising. Mm-hmm. And that's the logical solution. So as I was working through it, I noticed that there were some studies where minimum amounts of carbohydrate improved performance. You didn't have to take huge amounts.
Yeah.
So that was the experiment we did. And we've done the studies and they're about to be submitted, in which we compared what must you do? Must you take carbohydrate during exercise or before exercise? And the key was that before exercise, the people every day were taking, let's say, 300 or 400 grams of carbohydrate more. And what effect did that have on performance? That's the question. But during exercise, they only took 10 grams an hour. So they took 20 grams. During a 2-hour experiment, they took 20 grams of carbohydrate. Now, everyone will tell you, oh, it's the 400 grams before exercise that makes a difference, and not the 20 grams during exercise. Well, let's see what the results showed.
Yeah.
Because they might bring some nice, exciting surprises.
Yeah, very good. And then so have you done a comparison or seen a comparison done with, because obviously you looked at carbohydrate athletes and zero carbohydrate athletes. Well, what about that middle ground where you have a ketogenic athlete that you just give them, 10, 20 grams of carbs? Does that make a difference in performance, or does it still say the same if you're keto adapted? Hey guys, just want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Carnivore Bar. I don't promote many products because honestly, all you need to be healthy is to just eat meat. For those times that you're out hiking, road tripping, or stuck at work and you want a nutritious snack that is just meat, fat, and salt if you want it, the Carnivore Bar is a great option. So I like this product not because it's just pure meat, but also because I want the carnivore market to thrive as well. And the more we support meat-only products, the more meat-only products there will be available in the mainstream. So if this sounds like something you'd like to get behind, check it out using my discount code Anthony to get 10% off, which also applies to subscriptions, giving you 25% off total. All right, thanks guys.
Yeah, so the benefit of keto adaptation is that you can exercise with too much lower blood glucose levels. So that's a huge advantage. And we have answered your question, and I can't answer it because it's not been published. So
okay,
so,
we'll wait for that.
However, but I've always considered that it's the ultra exercise, the Ironman and so on, where you'll really get the benefits. Because when your glucose starts to fall, that's the one thing that if you're keto adapted, you won't notice it and you'll continue to exercise vigorously. So that's the one difference. And We are involved with another group in Australia, and they're looking at high fat diets and more prolonged exercise, including marathons and ultramarathons. And I think that's where the low carb diet will really be beneficial. So we've looked at very little exercise, small amounts of exercise, just 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you at 2 hours, what you eat before exercise makes no difference whatsoever. None at all.
Yeah.
And that's a breakthrough. But the other breakthrough is, when do you need your carbs? When do you need to take them? And you do need them.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you put 2 and 2 together, you'll know what I'm saying, but I can't say it yet.
Yeah. That was the thing that I noticed as well when I was, as I mentioned before, I was inadvertently a zero carb carnivore athlete in my early 20s playing rugby. I had a very interesting professor of cancer biology who told us about how toxic plants were and how carcinogenic they were. And he told us that he didn't eat plants, wouldn't eat vegetables, wouldn't let his kids eat vegetables. And in his words, this was because plants are trying to kill you. And that's so I've named a lecture after that. And so that left a lasting impression in me, clearly. And I just stopped eating plants altogether. And obviously the carbohydrates came with that. And so I defaulted just into eggs and meat and felt amazing. I mean, I've never performed better as an athlete and never had more energy. And I experienced exactly what you're talking about. Now I was doing not I was sort of in the middle ground. So I was, each training would be, a good solid 2 hours. Obviously there's starts and stops with rugby training and games, but I would recover very quickly. And I played for my university team, and I also played for the senior premiership team. It was in Seattle, but we played in the Canadian premiership and the USA top divisions. And I played in the Canadian or in the university division. So I basically finished college or my classes at 3:00. University training would start at 3:30, finish at 6, and then I go straight over to the 7:00 training and train until like 9, and then I go to the gym, and I might play 2, 3, even 4 games a weekend, and I just had boundless energy. I just wanted to go, 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 and so I certainly noticed that. Obviously, I didn't do anything in the ultra sort of realm, but when I would train on my own, I remember I would basically run, and then I would be sort of just bored. And so I'd just say, okay, for the next, because there'd be mile markers in the area I would run, I'd say, okay, for the next mile, I'm just going to sprint it as hard as I can go. I'm just going to sprint the whole thing. And so I'd sprint the mile and I'd feel great. And then I'd just be running hard, and I'd be sort of, juking, sidestepping in between people just to sort of get some like game sort of experience. So it wasn't even just a straight shot, but it was at full pace. And then I'll sprint another mile and another mile and another mile. And it basically just kept going. I think the longest I went was it was 6 miles there and back. So I think the most that I did was 18 miles, but it was basically just wind sprints. Just every other mile I was sprinting, and I just eventually just got bored. I just said, should I just stop now? I wasn't tired. I couldn't wear myself out. I felt amazing. And I just said, like, well, I guess I'll just stop, because what else am I going to do? I just keep doing this, So I definitely noticed that, at least for that distance, I felt absolutely incredible. And so it does make sense that you can have the same output, but then you just have this boundless reservoir of energy that you're tapping into, because I certainly experienced that myself as an athlete.
So my best rugby story about a rugby player is a chap called David Pocock, who captained the Australian rugby team and was known for being such a very vigorous athlete. So he was born in Zimbabwe, as I was, and he said the one thing he wanted to do in life was play rugby for South Africa. For various reasons, his parents left Zimbabwe and he settled in Australia. And he said he was so upset by the move that he couldn't eat properly, and he became a vegan. And then he still became Australian captain, eating a vegan diet. And then he read my book about low carb diets, and he converted. And he came to South Africa and he said, thank you, because this is what I did. And exactly what you said. He said, I was a better player. The irony is that when he wrote to me was just after the 2011 Rugby World Cup, and South Africa got knocked out in the quarterfinals when we should have perhaps won. But anyway, we got knocked out, and it was all because of David Pocock.
Yeah.
And what happened was the referee on that day was a total disaster. He made 46 errors, and most of the errors were made around Pocock. So when he wrote to me, I said, David, if you'd come to Cape Town 2 years ago, I would have shot you as you got out of the airport. So, but anyway, he exactly as you described, and like yourself, he's got this huge upper body, and he was just so powerful. Yeah,
that's funny. You probably would have hoped that he came across your book after the World Cup, so he didn't have that expected advantage.
we also, by the way, we also converted half of the Australian cricket team as well during that period, because my friend Peter Bruckner was the doctor. And Peter had converted to this diet because of what I'd written, and his own health had improved. And he was caught reading one of the great books on low-carb diets. And Shane Watson, brilliant cricketer, said, Doc, what are you reading? So he said, no, he's talking about low-carb diets and so on. And Shane said, I've always had a problem with weight. I'm always overweight at the start of the season, and I'd fast and I'd do all these things. But by the end of the season, it was finished. He then converted, and he became one of the great players in the Indian Professional League, one of the outstanding players, and he retired at 39.
Yeah, wow.
And he'd been on the diet for 7 years, and that prolonged his career for 7 years.
Yeah.
So many reasons why I'm proud that I converted, because I helped a lot of athletes. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, it's growing. It's really well, especially with Peter Bruckner and our friend Paul Mason here in Australia. They're making big inroads with a lot of the professional teams here now as well. I live in Australia at the moment now myself, even though I'm from America, and I've worked with a number of athletes here also, and some are open about it. Others don't want to give away the secret because it sort of is. It is an advantage that's legal, and it's not unhealthy. It's not like some sort of supplement that just hasn't been banned yet. It's just a nutritional choice, and but people are having massive improvements. Are you seeing that as well in your work, or people coming to you trying to convert to this?
Again, I think it's the same story that people don't want to talk too much about it. But when I look at the Springbok rugby team, I definitely think that they've changed. They're much more muscular than they were. They don't have that padding of fat that they tend to have high carb athletes. Whereas if I watch tennis, and particularly women's tennis, you'll see they've all got this padding. So although they're very strong women, they're on high carb diets, you can see, and I can't see that would be of any advantage to them. So before the 2019 Rugby World Cup, there was a picture of the South African team just in their shorts, and someone said that's the team that's going to win because they look fantastic, and I can't think that they look like that on high carbohydrate diets, but they keep quiet about it. And so it's the same in the Tour de France, The Tour de France, they eat enormous amounts of carbohydrate because it's the cult. And if there are cyclists who are eating high-fat diets, they're not going to say it because it would be against the cult and they would be excommunicated. In fact, the South African who I helped, and he has turned professional recently on a high-fat diet, he said, I can't talk about the high-fat diet because they said, you will eat a high-carbohydrate diet if you're on this team.
Yeah. I've spoken to a couple of people who again work with cyclists, and exactly right, because they get sponsorships by a lot of these companies that are pushing the carb gels and all those sorts of things, and so they just can't talk about it, or they'll lose their sponsorship, and they'll lose their funding and their livelihood and things like that. There was for a while there was a number of the All Blacks rugby players that were going low carb, keto, and then but then Weet-Bix was their major sponsor, and they're like, that's enough. You can't talk about this low carb stuff anymore. So like, oh, all right. But I've actually had a few of the people that I think it was was around 2015 or so that they started making that switch.
Yeah.
And I actually had one of those players. I won't say his name because I haven't asked him, but he has been an All Black for a number of years, probably a decade or so, and he has been low carb, really zero carb, and basically carnivore, full carnivore. Like on the off season, he only eats meat, and then he might add in a little bit of stuff during the season. But for the last 8 years, he's been doing that, but just doesn't talk about it. You just have to sort of keep it under wraps.
Yeah.
I guess it's for sponsorships, but also because, if everybody knows the secret, well, then it's not really a secret anymore, and you're just on an even playing field. Yeah.
Well, I know one of the front row forwards was a CrossFit proponent of the All Blacks. And I can mention his name, the Franks brothers, and they were definitely low carbs. I don't know if they're, but it's also interesting how that came about, because the Auckland University of Technology, Professor Grant Schofield, great friend of mine as well, and one of my students from South Africa went to New Zealand. And she was a dietitian who we trained, and we trained on the high carbs, And so she goes to Auckland, and one day in about 2014, 2015, maybe a bit earlier than that, Grant says to her, I'm hearing about this high fat story. What do you think? I'm sure it's wrong, but what do you think? So she went away for a month and researched, and she came back. She said, Grant, we've been wrong all this time. We have to change. And the Auckland University of Technology is one of the centers for studying low-carb diets in the world. It's done brilliant work. Nice. And that was because Grant, the professor, who was also an elite ultra-distance athlete, he also decided to change and found that helped him. And they then incorporated that, and they started working with the Auckland All Blacks. And I think that's where it sort of started as well.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. It's interesting because I know actually clinicians in New Zealand that are doing research into cancer in particular and neurodegenerative diseases such as Huntington's and Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, with the low carb, zero carb approach as well. And so that's interesting that it's just more conducive to doing that sort of research. There's less pushback maybe. At least,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's nice that more people are doing it as well. Yeah. So as far as the athletes you've worked with, and maybe before we get into that, we were mentioning off camera sort of some of the work that you were doing, and there was an argument about how you had to have carbohydrates to run a sub 2 hour marathon because you just have to. You're just not going to produce that much energy. But you made the very, very good point when you're actually looking into this that wasn't quite true. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there's a paper published in the Journal of Applied Physiology about 3 or 4 months ago, and if I have difficulty pronouncing the guy's name, I think it's Lukaszewicz, something like that, and he did a really good model, but models are not science. They are a projection. They're not an experiment. You base it on all your assumptions. So I took the article and I said, really, it's really interesting. Let's see if there are any flaws in it. Because he concluded that you couldn't run a sub 2 hour marathon unless you're eating carbohydrates at 90 to 120 grams per hour. That's the finding. You cannot run a sub 2 hour marathon unless you take in 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrate every hour for 2 hours. So I went through very carefully his model, and there were 2 errors originally, but they were minor because they the one made it worse and the one made it better. But when you took both of them out, it canceled each other out. So his model was valid. It's valid. But he made 2 assumptions that destroy the model. Otherwise, in other words, on the models the assumptions he made, fine. But there were 2 assumptions that unfortunately undermine the study. The first one is that you don't burn any fat when you're running a 2 hour marathon because you're running at 90% VO2 max. And that's contentious because we've shown you can burn a lot of fat when you're exercising vigorously. But that wasn't, but he could still say, no, but I'm right. Athletes can't burn when they're exercising that vigorously. Fine. Okay. That's your point. Go and study it. But until you've studied it, we'll accept that. But the one major error was that when you take in carbohydrates 120 grams per hour, he assumed that 120 grams was being burnt every hour from point one. And that doesn't happen, because when you take carbs, they take time. It takes about 60 minutes to 90 minutes before you reach these high rates of oxidation. And so you've got this lag phase. And during that lag phase, the athletes couldn't burn the amount of carbohydrate he said they needed to run that race. So therefore, his model proves that you can't run a sub 2-hour marathon on carbohydrates alone. So then when you retweak the model, it turns out that if they burn a little bit of fat, and like 7.7 grams a minute, which is not much, you're fine. You can take a little bit of carbs during the race and you'll be fine. So in trying to prove that carbohydrates are absolutely essential for a sub 2-hour marathon, he disproved it. Which is fantastic. He proved you can't do it on carbs. Therefore, you have to do it adapted to a higher fat diet. And then it's simple. The sums work out very easily. So anyone who tells you, the only reason why the Tour de France cyclists are doing so well is because they take 120 grams of carbs an hour. I can tell you that's just the way to diabetes. That's where they're going in the long term.
Yeah. And some of these studies where they did have the high carb arm and the low carb arm, some of the high carb arms, they actually were giving these people showing up that they were getting into like pre-diabetic ranges, weren't they?
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. You're quite right. There was ultramarathon, I think the Ironman winner 2 or 3 years ago, he said he showed his blood glucose curves because he had a monitor on, and they were all in the diabetic range for the whole race. He said, I'm not going to get hypoglycemia. I know you're not, because you're going to get diabetes.
Yeah, that's not the problem.
But let me tell you what I've learned in this study. This is that there are these two pools of glucose in the body. The one is the liver and the blood glucose, and the other is the muscle glycogen. And they serve totally different functions. No one tells you that. Just take the carbs. You need the carbs. No. There are two different control mechanisms. And the first mechanism, which is the important one, is that the body regulates the blood glucose concentration. So anytime you take in glucose, and particularly even during exercise, the body's first response is get rid of the glucose out of the bloodstream, burn it or store it. That's the rule. It's nothing to do with, I need it for the fuel in my muscles. That's not what's going on. The body says, this is a catastrophe. You've got to keep the blood glucose normal. And it's my impression and belief now, having read so much, that the reason why you have muscle glycogen is simply to store the excess glucose. So you dump the glucose. So when you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, because remember, we were carnivores for millions of years. We don't have the capacity to store much glycogen. We have to glucose, to keep the blood glucose normal. We just got to dump that glucose out of there and into the muscles. And then what happens is the moment you start exercising, you're going to burn that stuff, because the body says, I've got to get rid of that rubbish that's in the muscles. Get rid of it. Because this guy's, I know in an hour or in 6 hours' time, he's going to have another carbohydrate meal, and I want to store that carbohydrate. So that's how I see muscle glycogen. I see it simply as a reservoir for the excess glucose in the bloodstream. It serves no other particular function, whereas the glucose in the bloodstream has a vital role, because if your blood glucose falls, you can damage your brain. So that becomes the priority in human metabolism. The number one priority is keep the blood glucose flat. That's the number one priority.
Yeah.
And so it's very clear that when you take glucose, the body wants to get it out of the bloodstream as soon as it possibly can. And when you've got lots of muscle glycogen, the body wants to get rid of that. Now, what's really interesting, when you go one step further, the muscle glycogen controls its own metabolism, which is really the rate at which it's being metabolized. And it does that through insulin. So if you start exercise with a high muscle glycogen, the insulin is high, and that inhibits fat oxidation. And as a consequence, you have to burn the glycogen, and that's the body's design. You're going to burn that glycogen first. If, on the other hand, you start with little muscle glycogen, your insulin is low and your fat oxidation is much increased. And so you burn fat. And that's how the system works. But so again, I'm emphasizing that there are two pools of glucose and they're totally differently regulated. And people think, well, that you just take glucose and it goes and it's distributed equally throughout the body. And that's simply not the case. But the key point that I've emphasized is muscle glycogen regulates its own use. Now, why would that be? Why would that be? And why would muscle glycogen not break down to glucose, which then gets into the bloodstream? You'd think you're storing all this glycogen, and you need the glucose in the bloodstream. That's what you want to protect. Why doesn't the muscle release glucose? It's designed not to, because that would interfere with your blood glucose regulation. So the blood glucose regulation is fixed on the liver. That's the controls. And the muscle glycogen is a completely different control mechanism. And what I've given you is a very simple observation of how it goes, but no one has ever said that that's what's happening, at least in the physiology science, in the sports sciences. Yeah. It's all about take as much carbohydrate so you can fill your muscle glycogen. Actually, you're filling it because you're trying not to kill yourself. The body's saying, don't kill me with all this glucose.
Yeah. Yeah, that's always what I thought as well. The high blood sugar. I mean, this is what kills diabetics. Everybody knows that, or certainly every doctor should know that. And then, so your body recognizes this as, this again, a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Gary Fettke said that above a certain level of glucose in the blood, it's toxic. It's a toxic dose to the body, and your body responds to it as a toxin by trying to detoxify it and raising insulin to force this out. And that's what it does. It gets shoved in into glycogen in your muscles, in your liver, turns into fat. And also intramuscular fat, so myosteatosis, which when we look at MRIs, we see this as pathological. We see, especially in spinal surgery, this is something we've seen strong correlations with back pain and poor outcomes with spinal surgery is myosteatosis in the paraspinal muscles. That's something that we've actually long seen, that this is that you have someone with myosteatosis in those muscles would be like, they're probably going to have a bad outcome, even if you fix the defect and the compression. So this is something that's pathological. We're putting ourselves into a pathological state, and yet we're thinking that this somehow gives us super magic powers when it comes to athletics, and that not only does it give us a better outcome, it's the only way we can get an outcome. It's the only way you can perform as an athlete, even though we've been high performance athletes as carnivores, hunting mammoths and being endurance hunters and chasing down animals until they just get too tired and lay down, and you just go up to them and take them out. They still do that here in Australia. I have a friend of mine who just got sick of working in the normal life and just said, yep, I'm going out. And he just started living out in the bush. And very interesting guy, Adam Cavanaugh, I interviewed him, and he lives with these rural Aboriginal Native Australians. That's how they hunt. They just chase down a kangaroo or something and just keep running them down. Exactly. He says they only make it about a kilometer, and then they're just so hot and overheated, and that's it. Yeah. It's, so we've been high performance athletes for a long time. There was a fossil record in clay. It was a sort of clay beds. It was still wet at the time, and they found these footprints. They're, I don't know, something like 20, 30,000 years old, of Native Australians. And they were obviously chasing something, and they were sprinting, and they looked at the stride length, and some of these guys were going, faster than Usain Bolt. It was just absolutely flying. Yeah. And these were just normal guys. They weren't training for, the Olympics or anything like that. They were just hunting. And so how is it possible that we've been such high performance athletes who were able to take down animals that outclassed us by every physical metric? We talk about the megafauna and things like that. That's, that takes some serious doing to take something like that down. And we were doing it for millions of years. So how are we not anything except these amazing athletes on a zero carb diet? How are we not designed for that? It doesn't make sense to me.
So Weston Price, who obviously you know all about, when he traveled around the world and looked at the original diets of these people who hadn't changed their diet, he said the Australian Aborigines and the Plains Indians were the most beautiful people he'd ever seen. And they were the most healthy people. But as soon as they started eating the industrial diet, of course, their health went much worse.
Yeah. There was a paper in 2001 that came out, and they talked about like there was some work that was done by some anthropologists in the late 1800s with the Plains Indians in America. And they found that they were, different tribes were sort of different heights, but they found that these were on average the tallest human beings on earth. And I believe it was the Cheyenne, the adult male height was about 5'10". That was on average. And so it was much higher and taller than the rest of the world. The very interesting thing about this is some people look at that and are like, well, that's tall for an average, but it's not like crazy tall compared to today's figures. The interesting thing was that this was after they were put on the reservations and didn't have access to their traditional diet. They had already started to become westernized, and they'd already started having their diet corrupted. And so in their work and in his work, they even said that speaking to them, they say, we were normally much taller. We're shorter now. And so he was saying, wow, you guys are so tall. And he's saying, you have no idea. We're normally much taller than this. We've actually gone down. And it was theorized that if they checked this 100 years earlier, probably would have been much higher. Some of the paintings from the late 1700s and the scale that they found that a lot of these people from the Great Plains were probably pushing 7 feet tall. They're very, very tall. Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, some of them came out to see him and to meet him as diplomats. And he was 6'2", 6'2.5". So he's not a short guy, especially for the time. And he said that they were absolute giants, that these guys towered over him, that they were absolutely huge. And, they're just living a normal life. There's a book about the Native Australians in the 1800s. I think it's called Kings in Grass Houses. And they talk about how actually they were actually very tall. They talk about a number of these people who were just basically these gentle giants or extremely tall. And there was an assassination in the 1800s. Some British official got killed, and they really took it out on the rural communities. Unfortunately, they killed a lot of people. And unfortunately, this gentle giant in the story got killed. And when people came after and looked at the bones that were just sort of strewn about, and they're sort of uncovered by the sands, they found that some of these skeletons were just on a different scale. And that some of these, the forearms, just the ulna and the radius, were longer than the entire outstretched arms of the British soldiers. They were that big, just absolute giants. And now they are not. Now they are much shorter and much less healthy. And that's the main thing, of course. Obviously, the average height of a population denotes the average health of a population. And now the health of the population of the Native Australians is much eroded. When I first came to Australia, I was told day one that when you see a Native Australian patient, whatever it says on their chart, add 20 years to their age, because they just age so much more quickly and they degenerate so much more quickly. And so you have someone in their 30s, you have to consider them in the geriatric population, because they just get these diseases so much more quickly. It's actually quite sad.
Very much so.
Yeah.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you for that information.
Yeah.
Most interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that sort of thing, that, the connections with anthropology and our, and our living biology, and how much this affects us as athletes, and also as patients and as doctors, and what can we do to help our patients the most, and also be athletes. I think it all ties together. If it's something that should make you the best athlete you can be, should also make you as healthy as you can be. You shouldn't have to sacrifice one for the other. Obviously, people take steroids and things like that. That's another matter. But when you're doing something naturally, when you're just eating real food, the one should help the other. Something that makes you healthier should make you a better athlete at the same time as well. And so you shouldn't have to sacrifice your health for athletic performance, I think.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's what worries me about these high carb diets, because I think they cause inflammation, that the body's continuously inflamed and their performance is going to go down. It's easy in laboratory, you test people for one day and then you see how the performance went up. But what about a season and the next season and the third season? That's what's really important. I cannot see people surviving on high carbohydrate diets and performing year in and year out. One of the other people I influenced was Dave Scott, who was the really person who started the Ironman, the great iconic Ironman athlete. And he was vegan, vegetarian initially for the first 5 years. And then he slowly changed and started introducing salmon, particularly liked fish. And he came back at 40 after converting to a more fat-based diet at age of 40, and he came second. Nice. He said now he would never advise anyone to train for the Ironman on a high carbohydrate diet. He said it's the most inflammatory type of diet. You can't survive on that.
Oh, that's amazing. So in that vein, so if you're having a young athlete or maybe even a professional athlete who wants to try out a low carb, zero carb sort of approach to their training, is there any special way that you transition them? How long does it take for them to become fully adapted? Can someone do this mid-season, or should they wait until there's a break in their season or performance before they give it a try?
Yeah, I definitely think you should wait till the end of the season because your performance will go off for the first 4 weeks or 5 weeks as you adapt. And one of the problems is sugar addiction. We can't hide that. I think a lot of the symptoms as you change. Took me a year to get rid of the sugar addiction. But my performance went up very quickly, but I was diabetic at the time. So I think you should transition slowly and start at the end of the season, definitely. And then your performance, you don't have to train hard and you can be resting and so on. And I think it takes a minimum of 8 weeks before you start to really feel the benefits. And an elite athlete might take longer. I know one athlete I worked with took him about 6 months and then he suddenly came right. I can't explain why that is. But in our experiments, 4 weeks is enough to do the changes in recreational athletes. So 4 to 6 weeks is fine. But for an international class athlete, I wouldn't think that that's enough. I think you need longer than that.
Hey everyone, really happy to announce a new sponsor for the show and for everybody down in Australia, Stockman Steaks, who are delivering high quality grass-fed and finished pasture-raised beef and other meats, flash frozen and vacuum sealed to your door, something that I've been enjoying a lot of myself recently as well. They also have a great range of specialty items such as high-fat keto mince and carnivore beef and organs mince with liver, kidneys, and beef heart as well. So use code Chaffee today for a free order of beef mince or another specialty gift along with your order at stockmansteaks.com.au, and I'll see you over there. Thanks, guys. Okay, that's good to know. So that sort of begs a question: Have you looked at people that didn't just spend 6 weeks, 8 weeks converting? Have you tested athletes that have been in ketosis 5 years, 6 years? I'm 7 years now. I'll volunteer if you want to run some studies or something like that. Have you looked at something like that?
That's a great question. There have been 2 studies, published studies, in which they looked, Jeff Olick did the one, which they looked at ultramarathon runners who had adapted to the diet for some time. I'm not sure how many years it was. And they were just the same as the other athletes. Their metabolism was certainly different, but they certainly weren't worse or better. They were pretty much the same, but it wasn't a randomized controlled trial. So no, we don't know what happens after 5 or 6 years, but there's no reports back that people are suddenly getting sick or performance is dropping off. So yeah, and you wouldn't expect it. The problem with those long-term trials is that they're impossible to do. No one's around here for 7 years to do the studies.
Yeah. I'd be interested to see, if someone's, adapted, they've been doing this for a number of years, would they maybe even have more advantage? Would they be able to perform at a higher level when their mitochondria are completely turned over, when they're completely fat adapted, things like that? Because we see in the shorter term studies, we're at least not losing anything. by going
Yeah,
ketogenic. And I wonder if we'd gain something in the
well,
end.
when you're quite right, because when you're talking 7 to 10 years, you've got to fall off anyway. Most athletes' careers are about 10 years. They perform and then they start to fall off again. And who knows, maybe, and this is what I predict, is that you don't get that fall off in performance with age.
Yeah.
That's what I would think. So yes, you would definitely see an improvement if you're on the diet for that long.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I noticed that as well. I mean, I was 38 when I came back to this. And actually within 2 weeks, I felt amazing again. And I actually went back and started playing high level rugby. So my team in Seattle had just gone fully professionally. It was the MLR, the Major League Rugby league, just started that year. And I was like, right, I'm going back. I'm going to play. And I felt great. And I was out there mid-season. I was completely out of shape. Hadn't played a full season in 3 years. I just come back from doing humanitarian work in Bangladesh, very out of shape, but I felt great. And I was able to just keep up with everybody who was in mid-season shape. And in fact, 2 weeks later, we did the modified bleep test as a fitness test. I came in top 5 out of 92 athletes, all diet. I mean, I'd only had 4 training sessions. There couldn't be anything else. So even just that, because I was in a different state. Now, the caveat to that is I had stopped eating carbs a few weeks before that, simply because I've noticed that anytime I had anything with carbohydrates, my back hurt more. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to eat that. So I think I probably had a good 6 weeks of keto at that point, 4 weeks of carnivore by the time we did that fitness test. And so, a decent amount of time to adapt. And I felt absolutely incredible, and I felt amazing. So, and we're seeing now too, there's a few rugby players in Australia that are like sort of Marty Taupau. He was sort of cresting his career, and then he converted into zero carb carnivore with Paul Mason, and they spoke publicly about this, so I'm not giving anything away. And it completely revitalized his career. I think I don't know how long he transitioned, but the first game he played anyway, his performance actually went down. They track everything. They have these sensors and everything, and he wasn't up to snuff. And so his team was like, look, if you have a performance like that again, you're going to get benched. And he said, look, give me one more chance. I actually feel really good. We'll see how this goes. The next week, he had the best performance of his career. They had the best output. So it was just that huge output. And so that completely revitalized his career. And I think you're right. This is something that is going to allow people to play much, much longer and much better health. I mean, like the Frank brothers you were talking about, I think one of them is 38 or 39 and just got signed to another 3-year contract with the Crusaders. So obviously putting out some good, still playing some very good rugby, even and you think about it. I mean, now this guy's got 20 years of professional rugby experience and his body still works. So, I mean, he's just going to be devastating on the field if you can still athletically, physically keep up, and your knowledge and your game skills are so much more advanced than everybody else. You're just an absolute weapon. And so it's going to be exciting.
So how's this that listening to your experience, that lack of fitness is purely dietary induced damage? So that you're on a high carb diet, you have to train to get a reasonable level of fitness. But if you're on a high fat diet, you've always got it. It's always there.
I could keep going. Now I could get in better shape, and I could get faster, but obviously, I asked myself, I said, okay, well, should I ease into this? And I haven't played in a few years. I said, no. When I was 22, I could just go as hard as I could and couldn't wear myself out. Let's see if I could do it now. Sure enough, first practice back, I was just at a dead sprint. Yeah, it felt great. And and then the fitness test, it was fine. It was, the thing is too, is I didn't even try to kill myself on it. I kind of, I sort of, I'm a little embarrassed to say, but I as soon as everybody else dropped off and it was just sort of me and like 5 other people, I'm like, that's good enough. I proved my point. So just dropped off. So it was a bit lazy on my part, but I just wanted to show something. And so I didn't even kill myself. And that's when I ran out of gas. Oh, I just can't keep up. It was like, I actually just walked off, So it was, it's absolutely amazing. So it's, yeah, I'm very excited for more and more athletes to get on this anyway, and see exactly how much of an advantage it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, Professor Noakes, I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to keep you too long. I really appreciate you taking the time out to speak with us and share your knowledge with us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure everybody listening thinks the same. Can you tell us a bit about how we find you and support your work, and about your foundation, the Noakes Foundation, which I'm actually an ambassador for? I try to get the word out there and get more awareness for your work, but please do tell us about that.
Sure.
And how people can support it.
So when we wrote the book, The Real Meal Revolution, which was about the Banting low-carb diet, it really took off and we made a lot of money. So I invested my share of that money into the Noakes Foundation. It started the foundation. And that was 10 years ago now. We've been going 10 years. And our goal is to promote this diet and the science behind it. But not just that, also to look at the distortion of science, that you can't say what's the truth anymore. And how do people know that this science is valid? So that's our two foci, is challenging the science. How do you know that the science is correct? And because that's what I've always done. And the disproof, and the difference between beliefs and what is science. And science is not a body of knowledge, it's a technique, it's a method of research. And so we talked about the method where we took the high-fat, high-carbohydrate diets and compared them. And we specifically wanted to disprove that the high-fat diet was beneficial. And we couldn't disprove that. It turned out to be just as good. So that's the work of the Noakes Foundation. We also have an Eat Better South Africa campaign where we look at the poorest communities in the country and see, can't they eat better? Can they afford to eat better foods? Because I'm convinced that the basis for chronic disease is diet. And who's the most effective? It's the people in the poorest communities.
Yeah.
And no one cares about them. And so we work closely with those communities. And we've had some spectacular individual responses, people reversing their diabetes, who've not been told that it's simple. It's simple to reverse your diabetes. You just got to be careful about what you eat. So that's our goal. Our goal is to improve the science behind the low-carb diet and to encourage people to think about science and how it works and what is the truth and what is propaganda, which is so much of science today is just propaganda. And I think that, what's happening, we can say this as doctors, you're accepted as a doctor because you got a good memory, that's all. And you can memorize all this rubbish. But that's not what you should be taught. Once you leave high school, you've got to be taught how to think, and people are not taught how to think. And that's what I've kind of dedicated my life to, try to get people to question and to think. So that's another big feature of the Noakes Foundation.
Yeah, great. It's funny you say that. My sister, who went in to do her PhD in biostatistics, she said that and I was planning to go do my MD, and she said, and what some of her professors said as well, so MD, that just stands for memorization degree. And
that's a very good word. Yeah.
So it's fairly accurate. But
it's funny, but I'll end up with this story because I think it's kind of epochal. But the people who I admired when I started in medicine and medical science were two people who had worked at Oxford with Hans Krebs. Mm-hmm. And the story comes back to South Africa that they were the two brightest people that ever worked with Hans Krebs. Now, where did that story arise from? You see, you have to question that. Mm-hmm. And I worked with both of them, and I realized that they had no creativity whatsoever. Mm. They couldn't see the problem. And so they had careers, but when you look back on their careers, they didn't contribute anything of great circumstance to the rest of the world. So here they were, the two greatest scientists who'd worked with Nobel Prize winner, mm-hmm. Hans Krebs, but but they didn't advance the science in any way. They were good teachers. They were brilliant teachers. And I thank them for that. But they weren't creative in their thinking. And eventually they both turned on me, which was quite interesting. So that's what I learned. Yeah.
That's unfortunate.
And of course, when they came out of their grade 12 schooling, they were the top in the country. And so they won Rhodes scholarships and so on.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, but you don't find, amongst the Rhodes scholars, you don't find the great creative thinkers. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think they probably, So my grandfather was actually a Rhodes Scholar as well, but he was on the English lit side of things. He was a poet. And so he went there and studied English and ended up doing his PhD at Oxford or DPhil in English. So, and same thing, ended up becoming a teacher and a professor and wrote several books of poetry. But he had some very interesting stories about Oxford, but that was a very different time because he was there in the 1930s, and he was actually in the Black Forest in Germany when World War II broke out. And so he actually had to flee across Europe to get away from all the closing borders and the marching armies and things like that. So he had a very, very interesting story there. But it is true that you sometimes, when you get these degrees and you take these tests, it's regurgitating information. There's no standardized test that asks you to think and create something new. It's just, okay, can you repeat? And people study. It's classic is for the MCATs and for the USMLEs going to practice in America. You see all these people, and they're like, all the people say that how they got the top scores is they just memorized every single word of these specific books, and then they wrote them out and then read them over and then wrote them out again and read them all and wrote them. It's just a memorization degree. Can you regurgitate this information? And that does not help you even be a clinician. Maybe teach it, but not be a clinician. You have to apply these things. You have to have this information and be able to utilize it in a real world setting. And that's a skill that is not translated through these standardized tests, which is why I actually, just as an aside, found a study back in 2010 or 11 where they said there wasn't actually a good matchup between people with top board scores from top universities and doing well in top residency programs. It actually didn't translate very well. And what they found was that previous success in high-level sports was a far better marker of success in a residency program and as a doctor, which makes a lot of sense because no one's going to get there unless you've memorized what you need to memorize, at least to a certain degree. But then, can you work with a team? Are you coachable? Yeah, exactly. Do you know how to work together towards an aim and really bust your ass? These are skills that sports and team sports really do teach you, which is we've sort of gotten kids away from doing sports, but it's so important for life skills. It's not just turning them into big mean jocks that tease people. No, these are life skills that are very important. It's that ancient Greek philosophy of being the scholar athlete. As Thucydides said, if you separate your thinkers from your fighters, you'll have your thinking done by cowards and your fighting done by idiots. And it's like, don't do that. Yeah.
So I'll do a little story. So after I'd been thrown out by my university, eventually they asked me to come and say what I thought. And so I wrote them a long letter saying that the low-carb diet would revolutionize the management of all your patients in this hospital. Because something like 30% of the bed space is taken up by patients with diabetes. That's in our hospital here in Cape Town. And then I said, and what you need a guy like Jurgen Klopp, of course, this is the coach of Liverpool, who's just retired, to teach you about how teams work, because you haven't a clue.
Yeah, there you go.
You haven't a clue. And they never responded. That's too complex thinking.
Yeah. So what do you think about this? Actually, you know what? We don't care. No. Well, that's unfortunately typical of some bureaucracies, but at the same time, it's only going to hurt them in the end. And exactly. So hopefully they smarten up sooner rather than later before it's too late and hurts people. That's good.
Yeah.
All right. Professor Noakes, thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure speaking with you and meeting you finally. It's something I've been looking forward to for a long time. So thank you very much.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you. It was a super interview. I really appreciate it.
Right.
And best wishes to your audience. Hope that they've learned something from this and are realizing that the carbohydrate story is finally coming to an end, I hope.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you all for watching. Please do leave a comment. Let us know what you think. And please do go over to the Noakes Foundation. I'll leave links down in the description below. Please do go there and check out Professor Noakes' work and do support if you can. And thank you so much. And we'll see you next time. Hey guys, thank you very much for taking the time out to listen to what I had to say. If you like it, then please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and podcast. And if you're on YouTube, then please hit that little bell and subscribe, and that'll let you know anytime I have a new video out, which should be every week, if not more. And if you could share this with your friends, that would help me get the word out and let me know that you like what I'm doing. Thanks again, guys.